right, so today we are in our third week of this new series we're putting together called King David from Shepherd to King. The story of David, as we've seen, I think already in the first 2 weeks, has some fascinating stories in it. We're going to continue to see that throughout the entire series with a few of them today. In week 1, we saw where David was anointed as king when nobody expected it to be him. He was the chosen one. Last week we saw the story of David and Goliath when he became known as the giant killer. Today we get to look at the best example of true friendship in the Bible. We can read through the Bible over and over, and we can see a long list really of some great friends in the Bible, but none of them really compare to the friendship between David and Jonathan, King Saul's son. What they had was the type of friendship that anybody would want. It was a friendship that would never let anything get in its way. Some of the greatest friendships are ones that come from unlikely situations when it's not expected. Jesse Owens, one of our greatest Olympians in American history, was seen sure to win the gold medal in the long jump in the 1936 Olympic Games. The year before, he had jumped 26 feet, 8 1/4 inches, which was a record that would last 25 years. As he walked to the long pit jump, though, to prepare, he saw this tall, blue-eyed, blonde German who was taking practice jumps and was jumping around the 26-foot mark, which made Jesse Owens a little bit nervous. He was aware of the Nazis' desire to prove how superior they were, especially when it came to blacks. And at this point, this tall German introduced himself to Jesse Owens. His name was Luz Long. And he told Jesse, he said, you should be able to qualify with your eyes closed, because everybody knew of Jesse Owens. And so for the next few moments, this black son of a sharecropper and this white model really of Nazi manhood talked. Then Long made a suggestion that since the qualifying distance was only 23 feet 5 1/2 inches, which was easy for both of them, they should make a mark several inches behind the line to make sure they didn't go over it and get disqualified, to play it safe. So Owens did this. He qualified easily. And in the finals, he set an Olympic record, and he earned the second of his 4 gold medals. The first person to congratulate him was Luz Long, in view of Adolf Hitler. Owens never saw him again. Luz Long was killed in World War II. But Owens would later write, you could melt down all the medals and cups I have, and they wouldn't be a plating on the 24-karat friendship I have for Long. Some of the greatest friendships and the most admiration that we can find for others come from people in the most unlikely situations. That's exactly what we see in the story of David and Jonathan. We're going to see it today. Last week we saw in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel the story of David and Goliath. That 17th chapter ends with David before King Saul talking about that event. The 18th chapter of 1 Samuel is where we're going to be at today. But before we do that, really, I want us to understand, really, David and Jonathan's situation. Because it was a very important situation. We need to understand this situation because all kinds of people, we have friends that we love, we have friends we admire, friends we even trust with their lives, but it's difficult when tough situations are involved in our friendship. And most of us, if not all of us, have never had to deal with things like David and Jonathan had to deal with to remain friends. Remember from last week, David had just killed Goliath. The 17th chapter ends with David talking to Saul. The 18th chapter opens up this way in the first 5 verses. Now it came about, when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the son of David, to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now, that sounds great, doesn't it? Doesn't sound like there's anything difficult between them and their friendship or anything difficult going on. Based on what I had just said before reading those verses, we don't see any hint here that David and Jonathan would have a difficult time possibly being friends. At this point, David is loved and respected and admired by both King Saul and his son Jonathan. And much of the sermon tonight is going to focus on those verses, but first I do want us to understand their situation, because in the next few verses it begins to change. So let's look at verses 6 through 9 here real quick. It says, "It happened, as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments." Once again, this sounds great. David has won a great battle. Women are coming out of the cities from all over to meet Saul. They're dancing, they're singing, they're full of joy, and why not? A great battle has just been won against their enemy, the Philistines. But immediately, things will change. You've probably heard the saying that things can change on a dime, meaning that things can change suddenly, quickly, and unexpectedly. And things changed on a dime here in this situation. Look at verses 7 through 9. It says, "The women sang as they played and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s.' Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?' Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on." And here we begin to see what the situation was like that David and Jonathan would be in. The situation goes from joy and celebration to anger and jealousy, changed on a dime. David's become so popular that the king of the entire nation is full of anger and jealousy towards David. And all because of the words that they were singing. They were praising David more than King Saul as being the great warrior of Israel now. David had slain 10,000s, Saul only thousands. If you can remember from week 1, I said that David, when he was anointed as king, he was anointed, but he was going to have to wait. And so let's listen today to some of the things he had to wait through to be king. So we read there that Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. And the situation here, it escalates from that in a hurry. I'm going to kind of just tell the story of some of the things that happened here, jumping around a bit, paraphrasing some, and filling us in. But in the very next verse, I'm not going to read it, but in the 10th verse of this chapter, we actually read that an evil spirit comes upon Saul. David is there with him. And David was there during those times, if you remember, to play a harp, the calming music, to soothe him, to calm him down. But while he's playing this harp, Saul has a spear in his hand. And he throws it at David, trying to pin him against the wall, trying to kill him. But we read that David's able to escape. We even read that Saul was afraid of David because he knew that God was with David. That tells us a lot about where these two, Saul and David, stand with God. Now, it doesn't end there. It doesn't even come close to ending there. Saul was then doing everything he could to get rid of David after this. David had done nothing but good here. And Saul became so jealous that he just wanted David out of the picture. So Saul sends David into battle with the Philistines, hoping that David battle. It didn't happen. He even tells David that he can have his daughter as his wife if he'll just bring him 100 foreskins of the Philistines. So David goes out, brings back not 100, but 200 of them. Saul was sure that David wouldn't make it through this. Then Saul even tells his son Jonathan and his servants to put David to death. But that wasn't going to happen because Jonathan loved David as himself. Saul even threw another spear at David, trying to kill him as David escapes. So David has to flee and get away from Saul, and Saul was constantly trying to find out where David was so that he could kill him. Now, here's what I think makes it a difficult situation for David and Jonathan. You know, some people, it's like their friendship would just end then. They would separate. David's had to leave, and it's done with. But they had an unlikely friendship. We know what the situation was like as far as Saul becoming very angry and becoming jealous of King David, and he wanted him dead, but they were just different people, David and Jonathan. They came from different backgrounds. David was a shepherd. Jonathan was a prince, which would typically make him next in line for the throne, to be the king. Jonathan had his own armor. David had a harp and a slingshot. Jonathan grew up in the palace, and he was trained in the art of war. David grew up in the little town of Bethlehem and was trained to just tend sheep. Jonathan was the oldest son, which put him in line to inherit the throne. David was the youngest of 8 boys, and he was anointed the next king in place of Jonathan. Jonathan was from the tribe of Benjamin, David from the tribe of Judah. But despite their differences, they were arguably the best friends the world has ever known. Even though Jonathan had what appears to be very good reason himself to be jealous of David, just like his dad, it never happened. Jonathan already was a great man of war. He likely met this young David when David was in the palace on one of the cases where he would be playing the harp for King Saul to calm him down. At the time, David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep in Bethlehem. And so their friendship began soon after David slew Goliath. And after David finishes talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. I read that earlier from the first verse of chapter 18, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Imagine Jonathan's first impressions of this young musician who's playing a harp. He's also a giant slayer, a warrior by day, and a songwriter, and playing the harp by night. It isn't often in life that your hero is someone that is younger than you. But that was the case for Jonathan. Whatever mission King Saul sent David on, David was so successful that Saul gave him this high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops because David was such a great warrior and a good man. It pleased Saul's officers as well. David was a hero. He could soothe the king. He could defeat the enemy. The ladies just loved and adored him. It's obvious in the words they were singing about him, praising David over King Saul, about being the greater warrior. I think while most people in Jonathan's shoes would have felt jealous and threatened, Jonathan saw in David what God saw. Remember, we've talked about this before already in this series, but God doesn't look at the things the way we look at them. He doesn't look at the appearance. God looks at the heart. And David was a man after God's own heart. David often gets recognition for his heart for God. But Jonathan clearly had this depth of spiritual insight and discernment that's worth mentioning and remembering. Jonathan is a big reason that David was so successful and that he was even alive when it came time for David to sit on the throne. As different as they were, they had an unbreakable bond. No matter what situation they faced, there was no way it could come between their friendship. They came from very different backgrounds, but they had a few things in common. They were both warriors. They were both men of faith who served God. They were both provided with God-given courage and strength, and they needed each other. They became fast friends, and they sealed their friendship early on with an oath. We saw that in verses 3 and 4 that I read earlier, 1 Samuel 18, that Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. So Jonathan took off his robe that he was wearing. He gave it to David. He gave him his tunic. He gave him his sword, his bow, and his belts. And this oath, this covenant that they had made with each other would never be broken. After Jonathan continues to help David escape, and he saves his life on one occasion, we read this in 1 Samuel 20 and verse 42. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went to the city. They had one of those bonds that was just special. You've all probably got some of those. You can have friends that you don't see very often. You may not even see them for years. But whenever you see each other, it's like you never went your different ways. That's how I see this friendship here between David and Jonathan. Here David has been given some advice by Jonathan that before this, that Saul, his father, was going to kill him. So David has to leave and separate from his good friend. It's not a feeling we like to have. But they also knew that they had this unbreakable bond, this oath that they had together. And we know a few other things about those two from the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. We know that David married Jonathan's sister. He became Jonathan's brother-in-law. We obviously know that Jonathan ended up protecting David and saving his life, and that David was chosen by God and appointed to replace Saul as the next king of Israel instead of Jonathan. And still Jonathan loved David. He had every right, every reason you could say in our minds, in our human eyes, to be jealous himself and angry. Then listen to these words from Jonathan to David in 1 Samuel 23, verse 17. Thus he said to him, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not fight you. And you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also." Only a true friend is someone who'd be able to make a statement like that, knowing that they should be next in line. And instead of having jealousy and anger and resentment, he promises him that my dad's not going to lay a hand on him. You're going to be king, and I'm going to be there with you. He's like, my dad even knows this. They're knowing that he had every right to want the throne for himself. Jonathan also understands that this was in God's hands. After Jonathan's death, David would write this lament, where he once again would explain and express his deep and undying love for Jonathan. Their bond was unbreakable. It was a true friendship. But I want us to leave here noticing a few things quickly about this friendship. What can we learn from the friendship of David and Jonathan? We'll do these quickly. But one thing we can learn is that friendship is a gift from God. Do you believe that God is in control of all things? Even the people we come in contact with in our lives, especially those who become our closest friends. Now, if we truly believe that God is in control of all things, then certainly God is in control of people in our lives and putting people there to make our lives better. We call those people true friends. Those people are part of our family, could be, or part of people we go to school with, or people we work with, people we just live near, people in our church family. But we should understand that they're in our lives because they're a gift from God. And also, this is a simple statement, but true friends are true. It's a simple statement. But honestly, it can be difficult sometimes to find friends that we actually see as true friends. Like what we see here in Jonathan and David. Jonathan had reasons to give up. Their friendship was not without stress. Jonathan's very life was threatened by his own dad because of his loyalty to David. And yet Jonathan was a faithful and true friend. And in the end, David remains faithful to the descendants of Jonathan after he dies. He cares for them as if they were his own family. And then there's this one. True friends love you as they love themselves. You know, we can read 2 times that Jonathan loved David as he loved himself in Scripture. In the New Testament, it's exactly how Jesus told us to love when he told us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so for us as his followers, as his believers, it's important for us to have a personal relationship with Jesus. See, David and Jonathan's friendship was inspiring. It's amazing that they remain such great friends. But Jesus is an even greater friend. You could say easily that Jesus loved us more than he loved himself. He gave up his life. And for David and Jonathan, they had that type of true friendship. And then finally, true friends help you find strength in God. 1 Samuel 23:16, it tells us that Jonathan went to David at Horesh and he helped David find strength in God. What an incredible testimony of friendship there. You can't find a better friend than somebody who's going to help you find strength in God. When we're surrounded by friends like that, they're going to do a couple of things for you. One, they're going to keep you on the right track. They're going to keep you close to God. But also, they're going to do what they can to keep you from backsliding into whatever it is to keep you from God. And even though that's not sometimes what we want, sometimes what we need. Look for that quality in friends. Choose friends who are going to help you find strength in God. Be someone who helps others find strength in God. Love pushes us to better places. And true friendship will push you to God. And so if you're in a situation with some people or some things that keep you from being close to God and finding strength in God, it's hard to do, but those are the things that we have to cut out of our lives. It's easier said than done. Because those things that keep us from being close to God, that keep us from having true friendships, the things that keep us from doing that are typically our greatest temptations. So let's do our best to surround ourselves with people that help us find strength in God. That's what David had in Jonathan. And those are the true friends that have unbreakable bonds. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said this, that the glory of friendship is not in the outstretched hand, not the kindly small smile, nor the joy of companionship. It's in spiritual inspiration that comes to one when he discovers that someone else believes in him and is willing to trust him. If you have somebody like that in your life, keep them close by, because they're needed in the most difficult times. David and Jonathan, within their story, it covers several chapters. We can see a lot of qualities that we need to be looking for in true friends. People you can trust. People who will love you because they love you as no matter what. They love you like they love themselves. People who are willing to do whatever it takes to help you find strength in God. When you have people like that in your lives, you know you have true friendship. I want to thank you for joining us here for our third week of our King David from Shepherd to King series. Friendship's so important for us. I know we have God that we reach out to, that we search, that we try to find strength in constantly, but we need the true friends here that can help keep us on the right track, who can keep us from backsliding, who can keep us and help us to be able to find strength in God. When you find those, keep them close by. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation here this morning. Now, if you've never been one to give your life to Jesus Christ, you always have that opportunity to do so. Reach out to us. Let's make that happen. We're going to sing the first and last verses here as we finish today. Song number 172 in your hymn books. We have heard the joyful sound. Sing the first and last